AMD's two biggest issues with the RX 5700 series launch were related to the cooler and the drivers. The cooler had serious thermal and noise challenges, expected of a blower design, and it ended up running unnecessarily hot and loud for a GPU that was otherwise competitive with NVIDIA. The driver issue has only had partial resolution, but overall, partner model cards have been expected to solve most of Navi's launch issues, those relating to thermals and noise, and today we're looking at Sapphire's RX 5700 XT Pulse card to see if that thermal and noise scenario has been resolved. Before that, this video is brought to you by NordVPN. NordVPN is what we use internally as our virtual private network solution. We use NordVPN for international travel to bypass firewalls and at home for data privacy, especially from snooping internet service providers. NordVPN helps secure and protect your network privacy and is currently offering 75% off of a 3-year plan with 1 month free. Claim the offer at nordvpn.com/gamersnexus and use code GamersNexus at checkout or click the link in the description below. Sapphire's RX 5700 XT Pulse is about $10 more than the reference model, that'd be this card. So according to the pre-release pricing we got, at $10 more, you end up with a cooler that's got a dual fan axial approach. It has two 100mm fans, so they're large enough that they can spin slower to move more air than a smaller fan and therefore remain quieter. And then it's also got a fairly large aluminum heatsink on it, copper cold plate as expected. There's a base plate, and then the fins are oriented horizontally, so about half of your exhaust will go out of the case, the other half will remain in the case to be scooped up probably by the CPU fans, as opposed to vertically oriented, which a lot of coolers are, where they go this way and exhaust either up and out towards the glass or down into the motherboard. So the Sapphire Pulse looks good. Everything about it looks like a real cooler and a real proper video card design. Today we're looking at that one. We have benchmarks that are really heavily focused on thermal and noise. So we've got 40 dBA noise normalized testing versus this card, the stock version. And then we also have frequency testing, so we're looking at the stable frequency under a heavy workload over a period of time of about 30 minutes, and that allows us to see does the frequency decay as a result of thermals. Separately, this card, the Pulse, has two vBIOSes, so it's got a switch. That's a big upgrade. We like dual vBIOS because it gives you an out if you end up bricking something, and it also means that there's some modding capabilities that are opened up because, again, now you have a safety net. The second vBIOS is a slower one. The default vBIOS is towards the front of the card, and that's going to be a bit more aggressive fan curve, as we'll talk about in the testing. It also, therefore, runs a higher frequency because it can run cooler. And the other vBIOS, the non-standard one, is quieter. It sticks to a much lower fan RPM, but also will run into more thermal issues if you're running in a hotter case. So that's the basics of it. It's also supposed to be priced at $410 instead of the $400 for the MSRP of the reference card, but at $10 more expensive for what looks to be a much better cooler, and as you'll see in the testing, is a much better cooler. It's really not that big of a price jump. Let's get straight into the numbers so we can just talk about how much the cooler really mattered for this card, because that was the big hold point we had on the 5700 XT reference design. The reference design is just straight not good. We would not recommend it. And so Sapphire and the other vendors coming out today should start to change the story to be focused more on actual GPU performance and less focused on thermals and noise. We'll go through thermals and noise, frequency testing first, and then get through the games as always. And then we'll have a separate teardown of the card as well. If you'd like to see the cooler design, that'll be in a video uploaded on this channel as well. So subscribe for that. Let's get into the thermal and noise testing. Our first chart shows thermals at steady state after a 30-minute power virus workload, measured in a constant ambient temperature of 21 degrees Celsius and monitored every second of the test. The Sapphire RX 5700 XT Pulse clearly solves the reference 5700 XT's biggest problem outside of the launch driver functionality, and that's the problem of thermals. With both cards locked to a fixed 40 dBA, our noise normalized plots show the thermals for the Sapphire Pulse GPU edge temperature at 67 degrees Celsius. Which is a massive 27.1 degrees Celsius cooler than the reference 5700 XT at the same noise level. They're noise normalized here. They sound the same. That's a crazy drop. If you ran the 5700 XT under auto settings instead, at least with the launch drivers, you'd have found a GPU edge temperature of 79 degrees Celsius in exchange for an 11 dBA increase in noise levels. Decibels are logarithmic, and human perception is hard to objectively measure, but in our consultation with sound experts, roughly every 10 dBA increase results in a 2x perceived increase in noise to the human ear. That's not the same as the increase in acoustic power It's the perceived increase in loudness to a human. Very different things. So just to be extremely clear on that, not talking acoustic power. GPU junction temperature, which is the governing temperature for throttling and frequency, plotted at 110 degrees for the reference card at 40 dBA. That's TJ max. We're throttling. Anything beyond this we can't actually measure because the clocks are now dropping, so it would be hotter if we were allowed to run the frequency at the same level. The Sapphire card hits 83 degrees, giving more headroom for lower noise levels if you wanted them at any given frequency and temperature, and it's also a higher frequency for reference. Even full auto on the blower cooler, the original, resulted in 95 degrees for launch. Memory modules are well under control on the Sapphire card at 40 dBA, plotting 82 degrees. The reference 5700 XT's 98 degree result is in questionable territory where GDDR6 really shouldn't be operating. Finally, MOSFET temperatures run 68 on the Sapphire Pulse at 40 dBA or 78 on the reference card at an equivalent noise level. If you blow out the noise level to annoying volumes, it's about the same, but noise normalizing really matters here. These VRM MOSFET numbers are fine for both cards ultimately, but Sapphire is doing well at 40 dBA. B-roll of the Sapphire card makes it pretty obvious why it's doing so much better. The two fans are big, and there's two of them, and they're axial, so those are all good things. So far, the Sapphire card is massively improved over reference for thermals, which was our biggest complaint, the first one with the reference card. A few people out there tried to argue that the reference blower wasn't actually loud or hot, but this is precisely why that was wrong. It was both objectively hot and objectively loud, particularly in the comparative against partner models. There's no point in defending a bad cooler design, and Sapphire gives us the numbers to definitively show that there is a better way to make a card. At about $10 more than the reference blower, it's not even that much more expensive. The next chart shows the frequency response of the Sapphire RX 5700 XT for each vBIOS. It's got two switches, but also compares to the reference 5700 XT AMD card. Starting with the Pulse's default vBIOS, the right switch position, the Sapphire card holds a range of about 1880 MHz to 1910 MHz, bouncing around hard as a result of AMD's various power, voltage, and thermal thresholds, and because it's being pushed pretty high already. For comparison, the reference 5700 XT by AMD held a range of about 1860 MHz to 1906 MHz, so they're pretty close to each other, with the average closer to 1880, maybe 1885. The reference card bounces around less dramatically, but also maintains a lower overall average GPU core clock. And for reference, the GPU core clock will change depending on the workload, so this won't be the same in every single game or application, but we're using the same application tested the same way for each of these cards, so they are directly comparable. Finally, for the left vBIOS switch on the Pulse, frequency starts around 1830 to 1850 MHz, but falls with the rise in thermals to a range of 1815 to 1840 MHz, averaging around 1830. This directly correlates with performance, of course, so you'd run a lower FPS in exchange for the lower frequency, but also a lower frequency means the card isn't working as hard. The left vBIOS is also less sporadic and more stable in frequency, but it's lower performing overall. For how this translates to fan speed, here's the next chart with just the Pulse vBIOS switch positions. The reference card isn't shown since it's a different fan, so a direct RPM to RPM comparison isn't linear and doesn't make sense. Fan speed will be chosen along an RPM temperature curve, so each vBIOS has a temperature target, then it adjusts the fan to meet the target. The Pulse with the default BIOS tries to maintain a GPU temperature target of about 71 degrees Celsius edge temperature, not junction temperature, during load, plotted here. The left vBIOS allows for more silence and enforces a temperature limit of about 74 degrees Celsius, but it also downclocks, so it'd be running hotter here, much hotter, if maintaining the same 1900 MHz clock as the first default vBIOS. As for how fan speed is affected, the default vBIOS pegs the Pulse fan RPM to about 1570, or just under 40 dBA at 20 inches in a room with a noise floor of 26 dB. The left vBIOS, the quieter one, pegs RPM to about 1000 after an initial burst period. This heavily controls noise level and brings down the card to about 33 to 34 dBA on an open-air bench at 20 inches. In your average computer case, you'd never hear this, but it also run at least 5 to 10 degrees hotter in an average computer case, to be fair. We wouldn't recommend this vBIOS switch for anyone putting the card under routine heavy loads, but it'd be fine for a user with less heavy usage or a case with heavy airflow focus or direct-to-GPU focus, like an 011 Dynamic or something like that. The next question is how the two different vBIOSes impact VRM and memory thermals. We do a lot of stress testing for thermals with FurMark, but for this, we're just using a constant 3D Mark workload to generate something more similar to a game. Not to be annoying, but again, remember that this is with lower frequency on the left VBIOS, so the numbers aren't perfectly comparable, but this gives us an idea. With the default VBIOS, the GPU edge temperature averages to around 71 degrees in 3D Mark, or nearing 74 degrees with the other VBIOS. GPU junction temperature, the hottest single spot on the GPU, is the same in each test, roughly 87 degrees. This is with ambient accounted for and controlled to 21 degrees. As a reminder, the memory modules show a big difference. Memory on this card benefits a lot from the fan, so dropping to 1000 RPM increases the already hot GDDR6 modules up to about 92 degrees Celsius. In a hot case, that'd be entering dangerous territory for memory, so we'd again advise against using this in hot cases for heavy loads. The VRM MOSFET temperatures also climb about 8 degrees, but we're still well within reasonable operating range. Sniper Elite 4 will start us off for games. Overclocking worked out a bit better with a Sapphire card than with our reference 5700 XT, but that's because our memory was better on the Sapphire card. The actual AMD overclocking process is still either broken or just will never have that much headroom to begin with. This is luck of the draw on the memory because the memory on our 5700 non-XT was also better than our XT, but either way, we'll take the gains. Full stock, the Sapphire 5700 XT Pulse ends up at 71 FPS average with the default VBIOS. 69.5 FPS average was achieved with the quieter VBIOS, but note that this would be worse in a hotter case. And both of these are setting our frame rate as within run-to-run variants of the 5700 XT reference card's 71 FPS average. There's no improvement at stock when it comes to raw frame rate, but again, there's a bigger picture of noise and thermals. With lower thermals at a given noise level, you can get the same experience for significantly quieter, and that does matter. Further, overclocking the memory worked better in Sniper than it did in some of our other games, where we were able to hit 950 megahertz instead of just 900 that we did on the original reference card, although in a lot of the other games we tested, we did have to drop down to 940 or 935 to get stability and everything. The 5700 XT Pulse hit 78 FPS average when overclocked, with a low scaling similarly, and demonstrating that the overclock is stable in this game. 78 FPS average gives us a gain of almost 10% over the stock Sapphire 5700 XT Pulse or the reference card, but this is the last title where we'll see a gain that big from overclocking. F1 2018 is next, giving us a DirectX 11 Classic look rather than the previous DX12 and Async Compute title. At 1080p, the RX 5700 XT Pulse maintained 151 FPS average, which is within run-to-run variants of the RX 5700 XT reference card by AMD. Lows are also within the wider variants, so there's functionally no difference in gaming performance when ignoring thermal, acoustic, and general quality of life improvements from the Sapphire card. Toggling to the quieter VBIOS brought us down to 149 FPS average, and overclocking brought us up to 156 FPS average on the Sapphire 5700 XT with a 950 megahertz memory clock on this title at 1080p, although we dropped it at 1440 and 4K, and that resulted in a gain of 3.6% over the stock 5700 XT Pulse. At 1440p, the 5700 XT Pulse managed 115.7 FPS average, which is well within the variance of the reference 114.9 FPS average. Lows were also within variance. The quieter VBIOS brings performance down to 113.6, establishing that the default position runs about 1.8% faster than the quieter position. That said, even the default VBIOS is significantly quieter and cooler than the 5700 XT reference card, so you don't really even need the quiet one to get an improvement over that. Overclocking allowed the Pulse to increase to 121 FPS average, a 4.7% gain, entirely thanks to that memory bump. At this point, we're not sure if the core frequency knob is limited in usefulness, broken, if Navi is limited, or if the drivers need improvement. But we want to see more improvement out of overclocking than we're getting. It seems like, for the most part, this is going to come down to how good is the memory you got on your model. And unless any manufacturer is guaranteeing a memory clock, there's not much you can do about that. Navi really needs that faster memory and seems to follow the trend of AMD cards being memory bound more than anything. Comparatively, an RTX 2070 Super is encroached upon by the overclocked 5700 XT cards, and the 5700 XT card also outperforms the 2060 Super, which is at 104 FPS average in the stock position. At 4K, the 5700 XT Pulse established that it's fully capable of 4K gaming with the right games. F1 is one of the easier ones to run, although lows begin suffering as we pump the resolution. The reference card's 68.9 FPS average and the Pulse's 69.4 FPS average are within variance, once again, but overclocking bumped the 5700 XT Pulse to 74 FPS average. We're ahead of the 2060 Super with an overclock and stock to stock, behind the 2070 Super without any tuning. The 2070 Super stock maintains a lead of about 6% over the Pulse when both are set to stock settings. Shadow of the Tomb Raider with DirectX 12 is next. 1080p has the RX 5700 XT at 124 FPS average for the reference model, with the Pulse also at about 124 to 125. There's no straight benefit, once again, other than other quality of life improvements that we discussed earlier. It's not like just buying a partner model will immediately improve FPS. It does depend on the card, of course. Some of them might pre-overclock higher than others. But ultimately, you're looking at a scenario like this, where it's about the same out of the box, except for the things that we thought really mattered, like thermals and noise. We dropped the overclocking numbers at this point too, because Shadow of the Tomb Raider, with any overclock on our Pulse at all, would trigger a hard shutdown. Just a black screen. It's the same behavior as OCP would trigger, which is odd because there wasn't any OCP issues. So this is an AMD driver issue, and even dropping down to 920 megahertz memory caused the same hard crash. So we ended up giving up on overclocking numbers from this point on and just focused on the basics. At the end of the day, if all we're doing is overclocking the memory a bit, it's kind of the same as our 5700 XT overclock, so there's no point in doing that again, with the reference model that is. It seems AMD still has a ton to fix in its broken overclocking behavior for the Navi series cards, but at least Sapphire picked up the slack on the cooler. At 1440p, the RX 5700 XT Pulse runs at 85 FPS average, which is about the same as the 84.5 FPS of the reference card. The left VBIOS drops to 83.4 FPS average, allowing the default VBIOS a lead of 2% on the Pulse card. Nothing else here is really worth talking about since it's the same numbers as the reference review, aside from noise and thermals. There's a clear trend here, so no point in showing 4K numbers. Go check out reference 5700 XT review from launch day if you want the rest of the game benchmark numbers for Shadow of the Tomb Raider. But let's move on. Strange Brigade with DirectX 12 is up next. As a reminder, AMD has been doing better in DX12 with some cards in Strange Brigade than with Vulkan. At 1440p, the 5700 XT Pulse stock VBIOS runs at 124.5 FPS average, within variance of the 123.8 FPS average of the reference card. The left VBIOS drops down to 122 FPS average just for point of reference. We're going to stop at this point. We have numbers for Strange Brigade at 4K with Vulkan. We have numbers for Hitman 2 and DX12 and DX11 at 3 resolutions each. We have Far Cry 5 and 3 resolutions, GTA 5 and 3 resolutions, but none of it matters. At the end of the day, raw FPS is equal between reference and the Pulse, so you can check our original review for the rest of those numbers. This is all about thermals and noise. That's all that matters for this review, other than maybe some follow-ups on overclocking. The game results, clearly, there's no real difference. We have all the other data, as stated, but if you want the rest of the FPS data, you should just check our initial 5700 XT reference card review, because the FPS numbers are the same. So if you're looking for FPS comparison to NVIDIA or other AMD cards, check that review. But for this one, it's the same performance as reference, so what's really improved is everything else, which is important. The noise levels, you can now run the card at 40 dBA and not incinerate it. It's almost 30 degrees cooler with a 40 dBA noise normalized test setup. And even if you ran the original one without that constraint of noise normalizing at a lower fan RPM, you'd still be running at like 10 dBA higher than this thing can for the same frequency. Actually, this gets a higher frequency technically, even with that noise reduction. So Sapphire has done a good job with its Pulse for the 5700 XT. The cooler's good. Thermals and noise levels are drastically improved. Memory temperatures are also dropped to the 80s from nearly 100 degrees Celsius at 40 dBA originally, which is a massive step up. So if you're buying an RX 5700 XT for sure, if you've already decided you're buying one of these cards and it's just a matter of what card do you buy, we have no issues recommending the Sapphire Pulse. It's done well. It objectively is just massively improved over the original, the reference model, and we have no issue recommending Sapphire's version of this cooler. We haven't tested the other coolers, so of course it's possible and likely that there are better ones on the market, but for what we know today, at $10 more than MSRP, this one is not only majorly better than the reference design, it's probably in the good enough territory where anything that's improved over this cooler might not be meaningfully so. So that's kind of where we stand on it. And again, we might look at more models later. If there's interest in a specific one, let us know below and maybe we'll buy one of those. Now the biggest downside here is still, it's on AMD. This is not a Sapphire issue at this point. It's an AMD issue, and it's the drivers. The drivers have been improved, so they've updated a few things, like that issue with the coloration that we complained about in the original review, where the out-of-box experience for this thing, when we first got it, was you install the drivers on any one of, I think we tested it on 3 or 4 different Windows installs and systems, and every time, without fail, after driver install, the screen just flashed a really bright green or pink or something, and it required a restart. And it was solvable by restarting it. But that's a terrible out-of-box experience. AMD has fixed that. That's fantastic. That's really good news. That's an issue that never should have been there to begin with, so it's kind of inappropriate to give praise for fixing it. Good job, AMD. You fixed an issue that shouldn't have been there, and that actually is a pretty big improvement in our books. Now, unfortunately, there's still other issues. Drivers are in a state where they're sort of good enough. We didn't encounter any issues when running stock from just one test to the next. We were able to run the whole bench suite without any random crashes, things like that. But there are still issues, and most of them are quality of life things, like trying to actually change anything in software, with any software, not just Wattman, Afterburner as well. So this is an AMD API issue. But a couple of the issues, as quickly as we can recap them, I did one take of this already, and it was 15 minutes long, but one of them, setting a fan speed does not apply under idle. So if you want the fans to spin at 40% at all times, it won't actually start spinning until there's a GPU load now. We view this as unexpected behavior for the software. If the user sets a fan speed override, by nature of being an override, the fan should spin at that speed at all times, period. So for fan noise testing, we actually had to run 3D Mark in the background just to change the fan speeds. You can't change it on desktop, it won't do anything. And normally we would do it idle from desktop. Also, there's an issue with reporting. Sometimes the software report frequencies that are impossible to hit, like in the tens of thousands. There's also a small bug that's not really too important, but at 0 RPM mode, the fans, you'll see them not spinning, but software reports it as a 4% fan speed, like 200 RPM, which is obviously not correct. Setting a higher fan speed is an issue as well. You can't bring it back down, really. So this has been around since Vega Frontier Edition. It is incredibly frustrating that AMD hasn't fixed this yet. We have privately complained about it, and then we publicly complained about it. It's still there. If you set a fan speed of, let's say, 70%, 80%, 90%, doesn't matter, and you try to bring it down, you basically have to restart to change the fan speed, or wait an extremely long period of time. We walked away once for half an hour, and it reset itself. But this has been a bug for a long time. It exists in Afterburner, it exists in Wattman. It's an API issue or something. We want to see it fixed. And then also the new driver has black screen, hard crash, and lock issues that resemble OCP, but we don't think it's OCP because that doesn't make any sense. And this is just when overclocking the Sapphire card. This is not a Sapphire issue, this is an AMD driver issue, but basically the problem we run into is when applying even a light overclock of, let's say, 10 megahertz to memory, even though we know that's stable, it'll survive 8 hours burn-in with like a 40 megahertz increase, 940 megahertz. Even though we know 10 megahertz extra is stable, in some games, seemingly randomly, we're not quite sure, it'll just snap. It just shuts down, and you have to restart. So it's a completely graceless, really hard crash, and that's bad. AMD has this issue where with overclocking, not sure if it's just a bug in general or it's some instability that's encountered, but AMD's failures with overclocking, when they happen, are graceless, and so the software will bug out and be unusable, and you'll have to restart, or it just shuts down on its own. You have to turn it back on, or it restarts hard boot. So this is an issue where NVIDIA does a good job with graceful failures, where unless you're under LN2 or pushing extreme clocks, for the most part, when you're testing stability, a clock fails, you just restart the application. You don't need to restart the whole computer. This is something we think AMD can improve upon, and we would really like to see it, but they seem to be behind still on drivers and on software in some ways, where other parts of their software, like the video capture stuff, the Relive suite, that's really good. It's just that the core driver suite needs further improvements. Overall, though, we think that they're usable. You can play the games. Some people, most probably won't ever notice these issues, and then those of you who do, we just want you to be aware of them, even though, you know, you can work with them, you can live with them. It's just kind of annoying quality of life stuff. Now, let's get back to the roots of this. This card, Sapphire's Pulse 5700 XT, is very good. We have absolutely no issue recommending the Pulse cooler. Sapphire has done a good job with this cooler, and it performs well for memory, it performs well for temperatures, that is, performs well for the MOSFET temperatures, performs very well for GPU edge and junction temperatures. So Sapphire, job well done. If you're buying a 5700 XT at $10 more than MSRP, absolutely no issues recommending this. We are happy to say this one's passed our tests. Now, as far as the GPU, the thing that AMD makes, the 5700 XT, the GPU competitively with NVIDIA is in a very strong position now. The 2060 Super is routinely beaten by it. The 2070 Super tends to hold a lead on average over the 5700 XT. A few games where that's not true, but on average it's a bit ahead. It's just that that lead is getting small enough now where the price difference doesn't necessarily justify it. So AMD is competing on price, as it always does. It's in a good spot in terms of price versus NVIDIA, and for those reasons, we can say that the 5700 XT, with a partner model, not a reference one, is a card that we are fine with you purchasing and using for gaming workloads. We just ask that you be very aware of all these issues that primarily affect things like, again, the phrase here is quality of life, meaning that we're not running into catastrophic issues that prevent you from using the device. We're just running into issues that are kind of annoying, but you can work around them or just ignore them. Like with overclocking, we're eventually like, you know what? It's 4%. If we get it working, screw it. I'm walking away from this. It's not worth it anymore. So you may end up in that boat where it's like, you know what? Is it worth fighting software every day for 4%? Maybe. No, not really. So it's not like you're losing a ton there, but it's something we'd like to see fixed. So that's what we've got for you. Good job, Sapphire, on fixing the reference cooler, and we'll link it below if you want to buy one. No issues at all recommending the Pulse. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to pick up a shirt like this one. Subscribe to catch our teardown of the card as well, or you can pick up our toolkit on store.gamersnexus.net also for GPU disassembly. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.